are listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Libertarian Institute has a piece entitled White House Considering Banning Nicaraguan Imports. Washington is undergoing discussions about cutting imports from Nicaragua, according to two unnamed sources that spoke with Voice of America. Analysts believe barring Nicaraguan imports will do serious damage to the Central American country's economy. Here we go with sanctions again. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So top officials said sanctions targeting Managua are under consideration because of corruption within the government of Daniel Ortega. The Biden administration has targeted several high-level Nicaraguan officials with sanctions. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said, quote, the Biden-Harris administration finds the actions of Ortega unacceptable and condemned these actions, unquote. Dr. Horne, is President Ortega an authoritarian dictator who is involved in corruption, or is he a responsible president cleansing his government of American operatives based upon Nicaraguan law, or some combination of the two?
Well, I would say that Washington, US imperialism, has an elephant-like memory. They have not forgotten what some may have forgotten. I'm speaking of the Sandinista revolution of the late 1970s and Nicaragua's subsequent de facto alliance with socialist Cuba. And then following that, that is to say setbacks in the late 1980s and 1990s, you see the comeback of the Sandinistas and their present de facto alliance with Cuba and Venezuela. And as well, Washington is hysterically concerned about the pink tide that's sweeping through the hemisphere. Speaking of the election of Boric in Chile, and by the way, pay close and careful attention to the referendum on the Chilean constitution that will be unfolding in the next few days. It will be a landmark globally. They have not forgotten, speaking of Washington, the election of President Petro in Bogota, and the perhaps pending election of Lula da Silva in the continent's giant, speaking of Brazil, not to mention other victories in Peru and elsewhere. And so from Washington's point of view, as Mr. Reagan used to say, Nicaragua is a few days driving distance, as he used to say, from the Texas border. And so, therefore, Washington cannot be indifferent to what goes on in Managua. And if I may, I would like to issue a footnote here, which is that you also need to consider Nicaragua and what's happened there since the late 1970s with the Sandinista revolution in the context of this really sincere mourning in Washington about the death of the last president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. But what's striking about this sincere mourning is that all of these pundits and commentators and officials have not connected the dots. That is to say, somehow they have forgotten that what put inordinate pressure on the then Soviet Union, causing the country then constituted to collapse, was the pressure involved in Afghanistan with Washington backing religious zealots against a left-leaning regime backed by Moscow, which was quite drainful, quite baneful to the Soviet Union's interests. And then there's the big enchilada, which is the entente with the People's Republic of China, which led to massive foreign direct investment into China, which has now created this juggernaut. And so I find it remarkable that with all of this applause, stomping on the grave of the Soviet Union, somehow these commentators have forgotten what contributed to that, which will make it all the more difficult for Washington and U.S. imperialism to confront the People's Republic of China because of this either amnesia or dementia that causes this forgetfulness, not to mention the religious zealots who have yet to be squashed and will be causing headaches for U.S. imperialism for decades to come.
Yeah, my first thoughts when I saw this was they are reinforcing the need for an alternative economic system. You know, I just read that Russia and Iran are integrating the mirror system in some of their payment systems. You know, there has been talk for a while about building a second canal that goes through Nicaragua to kind of challenge the Panama Canal. This is kind of, you know, oddly enough, the U.S. in taking these actions rather than, you know, if they do this, which seems likely to me, rather than, you know, just crush countries, they're letting all these countries know, those who have been punished and those who haven't, you better find this and support this new economic system because that's your only option. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, yes. And Nicaragua is key in that regard. I'm sure you're familiar with the Bolivarian alternative for the Americas that includes, of course, Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. I'm sure you're familiar with the South American counterpart, Mercosur, which is led by Brazil and Argentina. And by the way, note that just a few weeks ago at the Mercosur summit, you had President Zelensky of Ukraine seeking to dial in his green T-shirt to make an impassioned plea for support. And the leaders of Mercosur refused to take his call. They treated him as if he were Biden calling Saudi Arabia a month or two ago. And so because of that kind of snub, that helps to generate and drive this hysteria in Washington, which seeks to punish nations like Nicaragua, not to mention its comrades in Caracas and Havana, for daring to try to create and construct alternatives to neoliberalism, to this alleged rule-based international order, which is a veiled reference to a U.S.-dominated regime constructed post-1945 when U.S. imperialism was bestriding the planet like a colossus, and when most of Africa was colonized and therefore had no role in constructing this alleged rule-based international order. But now the tables have turned, times are changing, and hysterically, Washington is desperately and frantically seeking to hold on to a declining status quo.
To your reference to the days of yore and colonialism, Africans take UK to court over abuses committed during colonial era. Several Kenyan activists are suing the United Kingdom over abuses committed during the British Empire's colonial era, raising a case against the country in the European Court of Human Rights. The plaintiffs, Africans forced off their land in the Kenyan Rift Valley, are saying London violated the European Convention of Human Rights through the abuses it committed in Africa during its colonial rule of the continent. And I can only assume that as this proceeds and expands, that tangentially, the United States will be drawn into this. And it's also, to me, very interesting to see that now you have China, the powers of China and Russia gaining influence on the continent as the West power starts to wane.
Well, I agree with what you said, and I would urge our friends in Nairobi to consider adding as a defendant in this lawsuit the United States of America. You know that a few years back, I did a book on the United States and the liberation of Kenya, and I began the book by talking about the U.S. mercenaries, Euro-Americans, who were flooding into Kenya in the 1950s to stop independence, which emerged in 1963. Indeed, you may know that British colonialism, which sunk its claws and talons into East Africa in the latter part of the 19th century, British colonialism had a personnel and a manpower problem. That is to say, Britain's contemporary population is about 60 to 65 million, yet they were trying to administer a far-flung empire in today's India, today's Pakistan, today's Sri Lanka, today's Myanmar, a good deal of Africa, a good deal of Caribbean, et cetera. And so they had to rely heavily upon Euro-American mercenaries and personnel in order to construct white supremacy and colonialism. In fact, as I point out, the richest man in Kenya pre-1963 was a Euro-American. And so this is not just a minor point. You are correct to suggest that inevitably, inexorably, unavoidably, U.S. imperialism would be drawn into this lawsuit. And referenced here, we would be remiss if we neglected to mention this factoid, that as Kenya was surging towards independence in 1963, Washington was concerned about the role of the left, even though he turned out to be a neo-colonialist. Jomo Kenyatta in the 1930s in London had consorted with Paul Robeson and Kwame Nkrumah and C.L.R. James and was thought to be a dangerous radical. And so the United States was trying to construct an elite more favorable to their interests, which, of course, I'm sure you can infer by now, led to the arrival at the University of Hawaii in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when Barack Obama Sr., and unless you believe Donald J. Trump pre-September 2015, Obama II was born in Honolulu in 1961.
I did want to ask you this. Looking at this, is it it seems connected to me, the whole Ukraine thing, what's going on there, what's going on, the kind of anti-imperialist movement that's going on around the world. I look at what's happening here with these activists suing the UK. And of course, Macron barely made it out of Algeria the other day, you know, by the skin of his teeth when the Algerian crowd was yelling expletives at him and he didn't understand what they were saying. Is all this connected?
Oh, certainly. And speaking of Macron, I'm sure you saw the article in Rolling Stone about Mr. Trump keeping at Mar-a-Lago the dossier on Macron. Apparently, it's gossip, raw gossip, about Mr. Macron and his personal and intimate affairs, shall we say. You may recall that Mr. Macron, as a teenager, began to court his teacher in high school, who happened to be Mary, and then wooed her, and she became his wife. And ever since then, there's been all of this curiosity about their relationship. And I guess that Mr. Trump was going to try to blackmail Mr. Macron as a direct result. And certainly that may be why Mr. Macron has been on edge so much lately, not only with regard to Algeria, but recall the sharp words that he exchanged with Liz Truss, the presumed incoming prime minister of Great Britain, who raised questions as to whether or not France was a true ally, and Mr. Macron gave it back to her as good as he got.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. We greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, as always. We look forward to having you back.